The Yin and Yang of HIV by Dr Valendar Turner and Andrew McIntyre. Part 2. When put to the test, conventional HIV/AIDS theory is at odds with the clinical evidence. Is purified HIV no more than a tangle of cellular debris?
That's when I first started saying, they don't know. Nobody really knows. This whole thing is a big sham.
The real purpose of the scientific method is to make sure nature hasn't misled you into thinking something you don't actually know. One logical slip and an entire scientific edifice comes tumbling down. One false deduction about the machine, and you can get hung up indefinitely. Robert Pirsig, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Some scientific problems with the HIV theory. The theory versus the definition. The central premise of the HIV theory of AIDS is that there exists a unique retrovirus transmissible via blood and sexual secretions, which induces specific antibodies and kills T4 cells, whose relative absence then causes the appearance of approximately 30 diseases, which constitute the clinical syndrome. The theory, however, is rendered completely contradictory by the official AIDS definition used clinically. In Australia, an individual is diagnosed as having AIDS if he or she fulfills the criteria set out in the latest 1993 revision of the US CDC surveillance case definition for AIDS. Other definitions in use around the world make scientific comparisons almost impossible. In Africa, AIDS is diagnosed on symptoms and without blood tests. Since from 1985 the Centers for Disease Control accepts HIV as the cause of AIDS, it should not be possible to diagnose AIDS by any means inconsistent with the HIV theory. However, even a cursory reading of the 1993 definition reveals AIDS can be diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma, which even Gallo accepts is not caused by HIV in the absence of immune deficiency, without laboratory evidence of HIV infection, and extraordinarily, in the presence of negative results for HIV infection. Sexual transmission.
If I were to have unprotected sex with somebody who is HIV positive, how many acts would I have to engage in before I got the virus?
Just one. I assume one would be enough.
First act?
One is enough.
HIV/AIDS is claimed to be bidirectionally sexually transmitted. Data to support this claim are based not upon microbial isolation and contact tracing, as is the orthodox practice for proving diseases are infectious and sexually transmitted, but on mostly retrospective studies of highly selected groups of individuals, including homosexual and bisexual men, heterosexual men, and women, including prostitutes, for antibodies in blood which react with certain proteins deemed HIV specific. Included in these studies are estimations of risk factors for the specific sexual practices of penile insertive, vaginal, anal receptive and oral receptive intercourse. Homosexual men.
So the gay community wanted this to be taken seriously. So they were very pleased when a virus theory was put forward, because it seemed as if that would be a way to democratize this illness.
In 1984, Gallo and his colleagues showed that of 8 different sexual acts, a positive HIV antibody test correlated only with receptive anal intercourse. They also found that the more often a homosexual man had insertive anal intercourse, the less likely he was to become HIV positive. This is incompatible with an infectious cause. In 1986, Gallo and his colleagues reported they found no evidence that other forms of sexual activity contribute to the risk of HIV seroconversion in homosexual men. In an extensive review of 25 studies of homosexual men reported in 1994 by Caceres and Van Briensven, the authors concluded that no consistent risk of the acquisition of HIV-1 infection has been reported regarding insertive intercourse. In the West, the largest and most judiciously conducted prospective epidemiological studies, such as the multi-centre AIDS cohort study, MAC study, of 4,954 gay men, have proven beyond all reasonable doubt that in homosexual men, the only significant sexual act related to becoming HIV antibody positive is receptive anal intercourse. Thus, in gay men, AIDS may be likened to the non-infectious condition pregnancy. It is acquired by the passive partner, but is not transmitted to the active partner.
In the MAX study, they have shown the only sexual act directly related to the development of the phenomenon which is called HIV and of AIDS was passive anal intercourse.
Significantly, the MAC study also showed that once a homosexual man becomes HIV positive, progression to AIDS is further determined by the amount of passive anal intercourse sustained after infection. This is contrary to all that is known about infectious diseases. Infection, not repeated infections, cause disease. Indeed, the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons considers HIV positive surgeons to be, quote, infectious, and that they should not perform invasive procedures or operations, but they may provide these services to patients who have the same infection. Heterosexuals. The largest and best conducted studies in heterosexuals, including the European Study Group, showed that for women, the only sexual practice leading to an increased risk of becoming HIV antibody positive is anal intercourse. The unidirectional transmission of HIV observed in OECD countries is supported by Nancy Padian's 10-year study of heterosexual couples from 1986 to 1996. There were two parts to the study. One cross-sectional, the other prospective.
HIV, then we recruited their sexual partners and we looked at whether transmission in fact had occurred.
In the cross-sectional study, the constant per contact infectivity for male to female transmission was estimated to be 0.0009. The risk factors for the women were 1. Anal intercourse, 2. Having partners who acquired this infection through drug use. Padian says this means the woman may also be IV drug users. 3. The presence of STDs. Of the HIV negative male partners of 82 HIV positive female cases, only 2 became HIV positive, but under circumstances that Padian considered ambiguous. In the prospective study, starting in 1990, 175 HIV discordant couples were followed for approximately 282 couple years. At entry to the study, 1/3 used condoms consistently, and in the 6 months prior to their last follow-up visit, 26% of couples consistently failed to use condoms. There were no seroconversions after entry, including the 47 couples not using condoms consistently.
Padian runs a study. It's a 10-year study with the world's most virulent, terrifying sexually... this thing jumps, off of penises into vaginas miles away. How many of them do you think, after 10 years, with the world's most terrifying, virulent, sexually transmitted disease, came up positive? Nobody.
Based on the 286 men who became HIV positive in the early study, the risk to a non-infected male from his HIV positive female partner was reported to be in the order of 1 in 9,000 per contact. From this statistic, one can calculate that on average, a male would need to have 6,000 sexual contacts with an infected female to achieve a 50% chance of becoming HIV positive. If sexual intercourse were to commence at age 20 and average 3 times weekly, this would occupy a lifetime. Female prostitutes.
It's got to be heterosexually transmitted. There's no proof that it's transmitted at all at that point. So why not just say, well, it's heterosexually transmitted too? Because that made it a plague, and the CDC needed one. The CDC hadn't had a good plague since polio.
The notion that HIV is a virus which does not discriminate is also markedly inconsistent with the data obtained from studies of female prostitutes. Even if by some unknown means a sexually transmitted infectious agent found its way into the promiscuous portion of the gay male population in certain large cities in the United States in the late 1970s, as is widely accepted, and given the facts that prostitutes are frequented by bisexual men and that at the very earliest safe sexual practices date from 1985, one would have expected HIV/AIDS to have spread rapidly through prostitutes and thence to the general community. However, the prevalence of, quote, HIV antibodies amongst prostitutes is almost entirely confined to those who are drug users. Virtually all other prostitutes have not been and are not becoming HIV positive. In September 1985, 56 non-intravenous drug-using prostitutes were tested in the Rue Saint-Denis, the most notorious street in Paris for prostitution. More than 1,000 prostitutes work in this area. These women, aged 18 to 60, have sexual intercourse 15 to 25 times daily and do not routinely use protection. None was positive. In Copenhagen, 101 non-intravenous drug-using prostitutes, a quarter of whom suspected that up to 1/5 of their clients were homosexual or bisexual, were tested during August to October in 1985. The median numbers of sexual encounters per week was 20. None was positive. In 1985, 132 prostitutes and 55 non-prostitutes who attended a Sydney STD clinic were tested for HIV antibodies. The average number of sexual partners, clients and lovers in the previous month was 24.5. When an estimate was made to separate clients and lovers, the median number of sexual contacts per year rose from 175 to 450. The partners of only 14 prostitutes, 11%, used condoms at all, and 49% of their partners used condoms in fewer than 20% of encounters. No women were HIV positive. The same Australian clinic repeatedly tested an additional 491 prostitutes who attended between 1986 and 1988. Of 231 out of the 491 prostitutes surveyed, 19% had bisexual non-paying partners and 21% had partners who injected drugs. 69% always used condoms for vaginal intercourse with paying clients, but they were rarely used with non-paying partners. Condoms were rarely used by those clients and or partners for the 18% of prostitutes practicing anal intercourse. No women were HIV positive. At the time of this report, a decade into the AIDS era, the authors commented that there has been no documented case of a female prostitute in Australia becoming infected with HIV through sexual intercourse. Yet these investigators from the Sydney Sexual Health Centre concluded that there are still many women working as prostitutes in Sydney who remain seriously at risk of HIV infection.
The heterosexual epidemic certainly doesn't seem to have materialised in Australia. For example, in 1991, 10 years after AIDS commenced, researchers were able to write that no Australian prostitutes had been infected through sexual intercourse. None.
In Spain, of 519 non-intravenous drug-using prostitutes tested between May 1989 and December 1990, only 2.3% had a positive test, which was only slightly higher than that reported 5 years ago in similar surveys. Some prostitutes had as many as 600 partners a month, and the development of a positive antibody test was directly related to the practice of anal intercourse. The authors also noted that a more striking and disappointing finding was the low proportion of prostitutes who used condoms at all times, despite the several mass media AIDS prevention campaigns that had been carried out in Spain. Similar data from two Scottish studies, the 1993 European Working Group on HIV infection in female prostitutes study and a 1994 report on 53,903 prostitutes working in the Philippines and tested between 1985 to 1992 confirm that non-intravenous drug-using prostitutes remain virtually devoid of HIV infection. For example, in the latter study, only 72 women were found to be HIV positive. In studies where there appears to be a high incidence of HIV amongst prostitutes, there are uncertainties that defy explanation. For example, although HIV has been present in the commercial sex work networks in the Philippines and Indonesia for almost as long as it has been in Thailand and Cambodia, the prevalence of HIV in the former is 0.13% and 0.02% respectively, and 18.8% and 40% in the latter. If these are accurate data, the discrepancy defies epidemiological explanation and has indeed baffled the experts, although the latter postulate behavioural factors, such as one's country's prostitutes and clients being considerably more or less sexually active than another. However, one could also pose another question. What are the, quote, HIV antibody tests actually measuring? Be that as it may, since 44% and 34% of the Cambodian, quote, HIV and AIDS case reports till 31st of December 1997 are listed as unknown in gender and age respectively, data collection, at least by the World Health Organization in Cambodia, must be regarded as problematic. Contradictions.
In the vast scientific medical literature, over 100,000 journals published so far on HIV/AIDS, we cannot find anywhere in this vast literature the evidence that HIV causes AIDS, that AIDS is a contagious disease, or that it even sexually transmitted.
Why should HIV avoid non-drug using prostitutes? If female prostitutes who do not use drugs do not become HIV infected despite being seriously at risk of HIV infection, what is the risk of infection to the majority of Australian women who are neither drug users nor prostitutes? According to data from the National Centre in HIV Epidemiology and Clinical Research, vanishingly little. A 1989 study testing 10,217 blood samples of newborn babies found no babies and thus presumably no mothers HIV positive. If such women remain non-infected, how do their non-drug using male heterosexual partners become infected with HIV? According to Simon Wayne Hobson, a leading HIV expert from the Pasteur Institute, a virus's job is to spread. If you don't spread, you're dead. The overwhelming evidence from studies, both in homosexual men and heterosexuals, is that HIV/AIDS is not bidirectionally sexually transmitted.
AIDS is the best example of what's really scary and alarming and dangerous about our culture right now, which is that it's a culture of PR. It's a public relations phenomenon.
In the whole history of medicine, there has never been such a phenomenon. Since microbes rely on person-to-person spread for their survival, it is impossible to claim from epidemiological data that HIV/AIDS is an infectious sexually transmitted disease. Indeed, Professor Stuart Brodie has argued that physicians ignore the actual heterosexual data and instead promote the politically correct idea that everyone is at risk. Ideological knowledge about AIDS is far more likely to filter through society than scientific knowledge. The HIV Western blot test. The HIV Western blot test consists of a thin nitrocellulose strip in which are embedded proteins claimed to be unique to HIV. Each protein is labelled with a P, followed by its molecular weight in thousands. Serum is added to the strip, and if there are antibodies to a particular protein, this band will light up. The HIV Western blot is not standardised, and thus around the world different combinations of bands are considered positive. Hence, a positive test in one country is not positive in another. An African would not be positive in Australia. A person from the MAC study would not be positive anywhere in the world, including Africa, yet the HIV Western blot is considered to be highly specific and is considered synonymous with HIV infection. The diagnosis of HIV infection. The HIV antibody tests.
Well, HIV infection is diagnosed with rather now routine laboratory tests, which for which there are criteria for diagnosis established by the manufacturer, FDA.
There are two, quote, HIV antibody tests in common use, the ELISA and Western blot. The ELISA causes a colour change when a mixture of, quote, HIV proteins reacts with antibodies in serum from a patient. In the Western blot, the, quote, HIV proteins are first separated along the length of a nitrocellulose strip. This enables individual reactions to the 10 or so HIV proteins to be visualised as a series of darkened bands. The Western blot test is used to confirm repeatedly positive ELISAs because experts agree that the ELISA overreacts, that is, it is insufficiently specific.
Since '92, there is no Western blot in Great Britain because they saw it's a waste of money, you know. It's the same principle.
Prior to 1987, one HIV-specific Western blot band was considered proof of HIV infection. However, since 15 to 25% of healthy no-risk individuals have HIV-specific Western blot bands, it became necessary to redefine a positive Western blot by adding extra and selecting particular bands. Otherwise, at least 1 in every 7 people would be diagnosed as infected with HIV. On the other hand, although AIDS in Europe and the US began to decline in 1987, this trend was countered by the addition of more and more diseases, and most recently, mere laboratory abnormalities to each revision of the first 1982 CDC definition.
There's the saying that if you knew how what sausages are made of, most people would hesitate to sort of eat them because they wouldn't like what's in it. And if you knew how HIV/AIDS numbers are cooked or made up, you would use them with extreme caution.
The net effect of these changes was to maintain a correlation between HIV antibodies and AIDS amongst the risk groups, while the risk of an HIV/AIDS diagnosis outside of these groups remained slight. This was further accentuated by avoiding testing outside the risk groups. However, when such studies were performed amongst 89,547 anonymously tested blood specimens from 26 US hospital patients meticulously chosen to be at no risk of AIDS, 0.7% to 21.7% of men and 0% to 7.8% of women aged 25 to 44 years were found to be HIV Western blot positive.
When he came up with his first test, he tested 30% of the American blood donators, so let's say the general population, he tested them positive. And the industry said, no, go home, Gallo. We won't buy your test because this is going to destroy our business.
In addition, the US Consortium for Retrovirus Serology Standardization reported that 10% of 1,306 individuals at low risk for AIDS, including specimens from blood donor centres, had a positive HIV antibody test by the most stringent US Western blot criteria. Thus, the correlation of, quote, HIV antibodies with AIDS, which experts accept as the only in vivo proof that HIV causes AIDS, is not a statistic related to the natural unbridled activity of a virus, but is instead a contrivance generated by mankind. Not only does correlation never prove causation, the artificiality of this particular correlation severely compromises its scientific analysis.
That's not an epidemic. The number of cases reported went up epidemically, exponentially, because the number of tests that was done went up exponentially. How many doctors knew about HIV in 1983? 2. How many knew about it in 1985? Say 500. How many knew about it in 1986? 40,000. So that's where the curve came from. How many tests were done?
One of the most bizarre aspects of the HIV/AIDS theory is that different laboratories, institutions, and countries define different sets of Western blot bands as a positive test. The global variation in interpretive criteria means that in Australia, for example, a positive test requires particular sets of 4 bands. In the USA, different sets of 2 or 3 suffice, which may or may not include the bands required in Australia. In Africa, only 1 designated set of 2 is required. Put simply, this means that the same person tested in 3 cities on the same day may or may not be HIV infected. If the diagnosis of HIV infection were a poker game, a flush would require 5 cards the same suit in one country, but only 1 or 2 elsewhere. A virus cannot behave in this manner, but according to the HIV test, which is claimed to have a specificity of 99.999%, it does. As incomprehensible as this appears, further difficulties remain. For example, an Australian tested in Australia with 1 or 2 HIV-specific bands would not be reported as HIV infected. Clearly, however, there must be a reason why an uninfected individual, such as a healthy blood donor or military recruit, can possess even 1 HIV-specific band. According to the experts, these bands are caused by cross-reacting, that is, false non-HIV antibodies which react with the HIV proteins. Thus, it is axiomatic that an antibody which reacts with a particular protein is not necessarily an antibody which the immune system has generated specifically in response to that protein.
Since a false positive looks like a true positive, how can you ever distinguish whether it's truly a positive or a negative?
Well, that's a great question. It's going to be very hard to determine a false positive.
The Australian National HIV Reference Laboratory, NRL, concedes that false reactivity may be to 1 or more HIV protein bands and is common. 20 to 25% of anti-HIV negative blood donors will exhibit 1 or more bands on a Western blot. However, Eleopulos argues that if non-HIV antibodies cause 1 or more protein bands, then why are they not able to cause 4 or 5, or all 10? On what basis do experts assert which antibodies are false and which are true? Or how do the same 3 bands caused by false non-HIV antibodies become true when accompanied by 1 extra? On what basis do experts assert that there are true HIV antibodies? If the Australian traveller were to be tested in the USA, where 2 or 3 bands are sufficient to diagnose HIV infection, are his antibodies false in Australia but true as his aeroplane touches down in Los Angeles? In 1994, Dr Valendar Turner wrote to the Medical Journal of Australia, seeking justification of both the Australian criteria for a positive Western blot test and the global variability. The response by Dr Elizabeth Dax of the NRL did not answer either question, and subsequently correspondents failed to pass the editorial staff at the same journal. When the same questions were later put via the offices of Senator Chris Ellison, the first question was again unanswered, and the widely different criteria between Australia and Africa were justified on the basis that in Africa, comparatively false reactivity is far less common than in Australia, so that interpretation criteria to define true positivity may be less strict. However, no scientist can make such a claim without data.
Because of the different criteria that apply in different countries, you can test HIV positive in one country and be given an AIDS diagnosis as a result of that, whereas in another country you won't test HIV positive and you won't be given an AIDS diagnosis.
It's ludicrous that you can be positive in one country and not positive in another.
All antibody tests are subject to the vagaries of cross-reactions, and the only way to calculate the incidences of true and false antibodies is to scrutinise reactions against what the test is purportedly meant to measure, that is, against HIV itself.
Nobody can find free infectious HIV virus in a human being. That is why they have to resort to looking for antibodies to HIV in a person. That is one of the biggest flaws in the HIV hypothesis.
HIV isolation is the only gold standard by which the specificity of the antibodies can be determined, and this must be evaluated before the test is introduced into clinical practice. However, despite the Western blot test being in widespread use and a stalwart of HIV testing, these data have never been reported by the NRL or any other laboratory. Even without such evidence, since A, the NRL concedes that cross-reacting antibodies cause misleading reactions in the Western blot in 1/4 of healthy Australians, and B, unlike Australians, Africans, similar to the AIDS risk groups, are exposed to a multitude of infectious agents, producing myriad antibodies. False reactivity will be much higher in Africa, where the Western blot criteria should be the most stringent. If, quote, HIV antibodies indeed prove that 1/3 of heterosexual adults in certain Central and Eastern African countries are infected with HIV, life in these countries must be one endless orgy. In 1999, it was reported that 35% of patients with primary biliary cirrhosis, 39% of patients with other biliary disorders, 29% of those with lupus, 60% of patients with hepatitis B, 35% with hepatitis C, all non-HIV, non-AIDS diseases have antibodies to the, quote, HIV P24 core protein. Until 1990, an unknown number of the 4,954 homosexual men in the MAC study were diagnosed HIV infected on the basis of an antibody to the HIV-specific P24 protein, that is with one Western blot band. Why do not all similar tests prove infection with HIV? Why are gay men with a single P24 band infected with a deadly virus, while biliary and liver disease patients with the same band are not? Why were the criteria for diagnosing HIV infection set less rigorously for homosexual men and Africans? And if HIV antibodies are specific and HIV infection is for life, why do reformed drug addicts leading healthy lives lose their HIV antibodies?
And this time my results come back marked from the lab indeterminate. I'm faced with the decision, do I want to wait 6 weeks to test again or do it right away? I opted for right away. My results that time come back positive. Took it again, came back negative. I took it again, positive.
What happens if you're positive on one criteria but negative on another manufacturer's criteria? How do you decide who's infected and who's not?
You will use the most sensitive criterion.
Although all HIV experts accept cross-reactivity in HIV antibody testing, in 1993, the New South Wales Department of Health interpreted the discovery of, quote, HIV antibodies in 4 women as compelling evidence for transmission of HIV from a homosexual man during the course of minor office surgery in 1989. However, there was no proof that the man was HIV infected at the time of surgery, or that any of the 4 women were operated on after the man. This report remains the only one of its kind in the world, and it immediately led to the establishment of a special committee of the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons, which wrote to all college fellows, inviting submissions upon the matter. But rather than seizing upon the rarity of the event and following advice, urging a formal scientific inquiry into whether, quote, HIV antibodies are caused by infection with a retrovirus, the college accepted these data as proof of cross-infection, but concluded the mode of transmission is unknown.
These tests claim to be HIV tests. I'm going to read from a section that says limitations of the tests. The specificity of the Reveal Rapid HIV antibody test for blood specimens in low-risk populations has not been evaluated. They don't know, in their terms even, how well this test is going to work in people they don't want it to work in, low risk. We don't think you're at risk.
Unlike HIV/AIDS experts who claim the specificity of the HIV antibody test is 99.999%, one manufacturer of HIV antibody test states in the package insert, at present there is no recognised standard for establishing the presence or absence of HIV-1 antibody in human blood. Therefore, sensitivity was computed on the clinical diagnosis of AIDS and specificity based on random, healthy blood donors. The latter were chosen as de facto non-HIV infected for the purposes of determining how many tests are false positives. However, by this reasoning, since the majority of HIV positive individuals are healthy, they cannot be infected. Thus, the WHO predictions of a global pandemic are patently untrue.
If we were talking about reality, the reality is that AIDS is over.
To help sustain my channel in this time of censorship, please support my work on Subscribestar. Link is in the description. So that we don't lose touch, please find me at drsambailey.com and sign up for my free newsletter.